your review for your Unit 6 test. As a reminder, it has 30 multiple choice questions and 2 SAQs. You'll get to pick the one that you would like to do for the SAQ. As a reminder, that's going in because there are no revisions in semester 2 on your multiple choice. So this is a way to scale up the challenge as we approach the under the 3-month mark for the AP exam. So this raises the stakes. I hope that you find this video helpful. And what I want to do is start by setting the stage after we left the midterm. So before the midterm, we were looking at the Civil War and the road to the Civil War, the growth of sectionalism and the political efforts to ultimately, that divided our country over a state's right to preserve the system of slavery versus the North, who was looking to erode that, promote free soil, etc. Now, after the Civil War, in 1877, Reconstruction is going to come to an end. Remember, Reconstruction is that time period in which we would see the North occupying the South with their military, trying to implement certain responsibilities. We're going to cycle back to the fact that that doesn't pan out as the radical Republicans envisioned, for sure. But by 1877, we're over the 10-year mark for the Reconstruction process. And so in a turn of events, the federal government is going to withdraw from the South, and the government stops basically focusing on trying to implement the new civil rights protocols that were established through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. With that in mind, the Republican Party starts to look away from sort of restructuring the South towards making the country a more viable economy. And this would mean having very pro-capitalist friendly policies. And so the Gilded Age is sort of this era of really a lack of government regulation, what we would describe a laissez-faire government. And we begin to see a shift towards this radical moment of capitalist growth. In 1873, the phrase Gilded Age comes from a book written by Mark Twain, who wrote Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, one of the great American authors. And he wrote a book set in the time period in which he lived. He published the book in 1873 after the Civil War, and he saw that after the Civil War, the country was rife for political corruption, graft, exploitation of the working class, in the midst of several people growing incredibly powerful and wealthy. And the book focuses mostly on the sort of politics and the flow of money through the government. And so this is where we get the phrase Gilded Age, which of course means it looks golden on the outside because of all this, quote unquote, economic prosperity. But the question is at what cost and who is impacted by that? Now, one of the reasons why capitalism has sort of an additional breakthrough after the Civil War is we went from building all these guns and things for the Civil War, and our manufacturing in the North is largely untouched, and we level up large scale industrial production over the course of the 19th century. And as we get into the 1870s, there begins to be a focus on efficiency, trying to maximize profits and worker efforts. And because the government was fairly laissez-faire, meaning that they stayed out of business and let them operate without regulation or interference, this opened up the floodgates to the government, or should I say the workers being exploited by their bosses and bosses trying to maximize their profits. Now, there are some other technologies which allow for this to happen, one of which is the Bessemer process, which is this big, drum-looking thing right here, which was a part of this creation of steel. So Carnegie Steel building up our cities, right, and building skyscrapers. We start to see our cities go higher and higher to the sky during this era. We have the invention of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell and the founding of AT&T. American Telephone and Telegraph. Here we have the invention of the light bulb. We have a transatlantic cable for the telegraph, meaning international business is beginning to sort of go on the rise. And we have the creation of the transcontinental railroads. Now, after the Civil War, right, we're going to see like a new focus on supporting the growth of business, which is part of the Republican cause from the beginning, right? It's largely a northern thing. And so they're being very supportive of manufacturing. Now, by constructing the Transcontinental Railroad, remember that like during the Civil War, we funded that In the North, the Republicans did with the Pacific Railway Act. We would see very limited regulations on business and also very high tariffs, which is going to make it so that foreign economic competition is down. And so what we're going to see is the consolidation of wealth into large trusts or monopolies, which are basically a way of which we see many companies being organized under one board of trustees, or monopolies where one company is going to dominate. And if we look here, some of the top people ever to live in terms of wealth, John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, make like the top 10 in history, and they're all operating out of the United States. So the conditions were perfect for people to, again, consolidate their wealth. In the four sort of horsemen of the Gilded Age, John D. Rockefeller, owner of Standard Oil, Andrew Carnegie of Carnegie Steel. We have J.P. Morgan, who was a banking and railroads magnate and bought actually a lot of Vanderbilt's, original rail lines eventually. And Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was big into shipping on ships, but also the railroads eventually. Now, these gentlemen were able to grow so rich because they are able to get rid of their competition or consolidate the process of producing the goods which they were making. Horizontal integration was a tactic utilized by John D. Rockefeller, where you would lower prices to eliminate your competition's ability to keep up with you, and then you buy them out. So this allows for you to sort of, again, subsume other companies, and they become your workers eventually. And then there's vertical integration, which is the process of owning all the different elements needed to make a product. So if I were to own a Coca-Cola factory, or be a Coca-Cola producer, I want the sugar fields, the water supply, factory equipment, all of that. And then I'm selling it out of my own vending machines. So ultimately what that means is, again, I own all of it, which is going to help me to become richer. There's no middlemen. And these industrialists have created legacies for themselves, and they're keenly aware that history will judge them for their character, right? And so they strive to be captains of industry, those who use their wealth to benefit the public through philanthropy or by administering their wealth in a way that's good for the country. Robber barons, on the flip side, are those who hoard their wealth and, are sort of villainous for the way in which they get rich, exploiting the poor and eliminating competition. This would be a picture which depicts robber barons, where we see sort of these monopolies with their sort of gilded armor, right? And they have protections like the media, which it says that they've purchased here, or the corruption of the legislature, right? Congress and being corrupt. All these allows for the railroads to basically dominate their workers. And I think this is a really nice allegory for like the Pullman strike, which we're going to talk about in a few, and how difficult it was for organized labor to try to make it so that they could become more empowered. Here we have a depiction of Andrew Carnegie, who lowers wages for his workers who are already poor, but then uses the profits to donate libraries and universities. So this is criticizing Carnegie, I would argue, as a robber baron, even though it shows that he has elements of a captain of industry. Do the ends justify the means, right? How does he get the money to give it away? By subjugating his workers to very poor conditions. And then this is one of my favorites here, folks. This is a Senate of the monopolists, by the monopolists, for the monopolists. And here we have sort of strewn about, we have these very large money bags, the Standard Oil Trust, the Iron Trust, the Copper Trust, the Steel Beam Trust. And they are overlooking the Senate, basically implying that their money is going to pressure these folks into acting on their behalf. And over here, we see that the people's entrance is closed. Now, during this time, we're going to see that the United States is going to have an influx of immigration. We're going to detail that momentarily. But one of the reasons that they're able to keep their profits so high is the cost of labor is incredibly cheap during the Gilded Age, as worker wages are incredibly low. There is no minimum wage. There are no sort of rigorous regulations on working conditions. So, if somebody is getting hurt on the job, they could be fired, instead of given, disability or something like that. It was a tough sledding for the laborers of the Gilded Age who were not able to make very much. And the reason that work was so cheap was twofold. One, we see mass migration from Southern and Eastern Europe, places like Poland and Italy, and immigrants are willing to work for low wages because of poverty and other issues at home, all the push factors that made them want to leave Europe. And then rural to urban migration. We talked about the fact that in the United States, a lot of our farmers, as we'll look at later, are feeling screwed over by low crop prices and the high cost of railroads. This makes it so that it was not as reliable to be a farmer in America during this time. And so they pushed for change and it would move to the cities and, take on factory jobs. So one of the ways in which that the workers tried to deal with this is by collective bargaining, which is trying to come together to bargain with bosses for a contract. And this is what unions are meant to do. They work out a set of different conditions. And one of the groups that we see formed in 1869 is the Knights of Labor, which is geared at trying to bring together a variety of social policies that would benefit people of all types, women, African Americans, and European workers coming together, trying to get better conditions. The AFL, which would later become the AFL-CIO, was led by a man named Samuel Gompers. He's one of the key union organizers in U.S. history. He's a pretty impressive man, and he absolutely represented skilled workers, people that are working in, quite dangerous situations, and he wanted for his workers better pay, better hours, better working conditions. The thing is that organized labor was not appreciated by the laissez-faire capitalists of the United States. They see collective bargaining as un-American, and therefore unions are going to often get pushback quite violently in some cases, as we saw with the Homestead strike, where in near Pittsburgh, Andrew Carnegie's underling Henry Frick went in and he brought in the Pinkertons to try to put down a strike, and people die as a result. And this is what led to Frick's several attempts on Frick's life, which he survives. But this shows that there was a big divide between the working class and the owners of business. And there were other issues around the country. The Ludlow Massacre occurs out west, where mining groups were sort of living on the outskirts of mining towns. They didn't want to live in sort of like Rockefeller's provided housing. And so what they end up doing is sort of camping out. And basically the police are brought in and wipe out the workers who are sort of protesting the conditions. There are literal chapters of history they call like the mining wars, where people are like in the hills and more or less going to war with the National Guard, the local police, or in some cases private detective agencies, like we saw with the Pinkertons. With the Haymarket riot in Chicago, there was a variety of people who were protesting for better working conditions. And I think a 6-day work week. There was at one night the police force came in and sort of broke up the workers. Several people were beat up in the process. And then the next night, when protesters sort of went out again, there was a bomb which was thrown off into a group of police, and we see that German anarchists are blamed for this and that are given the death penalty. And many people didn't think they got a fair trial because of nativism, which we'll talk about in a few. And then the Pullman strike. Pullman were train cars that went on the tracks, and it would bring things to and fro. Basically, what happened is that the people who worked for Pullman lived in apartments that Pullman owned, and he cut wages but kept rent high, and so people went on strike. Basically, what happened is Pullman has this idea to put mail trucks on the tracks. And so when they're being blocked, it's a federal crime, and the army is brought in and people die. It's a very messy situation. But these are just 3 examples of many where we see the workers standing up for their rights and the sort of business owners sort of cracking down on those attempts at organized labor. Now, many of those workers, as I mentioned before, were immigrants. And during the Gilded Age, we see a massive wave of migration. Many people left their homelands in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, in Asia, Japan, China, because of various reasons. Push factors are the reasons why you leave, and you can sort of see them below, whether it's religious persecution for Jews in Russia or unemployment in places like Italy. These are all factors that cause people to want to come to the United States. Now, the pull factors are the reasons why you want to go to another country. And the number one thing is available jobs. By far, the Gilded Age provides people with lots of new work opportunities. And there's also, sort of this ideal of the American dream, which we sort of associate with this time period. The Statue of Liberty very much sort of stands in for that. And we know the poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty by Emma Lazarus sort of makes note of that. So where do people enter the country? Well, one entryway was a port of entry at Ellis Island in New York, where people would come in and they would be sort of processed. And then we have Angel Island in California, where people would be coming in, um, you know, to places like San Francisco and moving up and down the coast. At Ellis Island, immigrants would be examined, their papers would be filed, they would be basically onboarded, but the visa process was not like a thing, right? It's very different from the modern day where immigration is much more tightly regulated and people were coming in by the boatload, literally thousands at a time. If we look here, this is the wave of migration that I'm referring to. So after the Civil War, decade upon decade upon decade, we are going to see vast growth. Now, there is a small dip here. That is because of the creation of the Chinese Exclusion Act, I believe, in 1882. But we see that trend continues in a big way, and it's going to slow down once we get to the world wars. But this is the general trend following the Civil War. When people move to America, they often settle in little ethnic enclaves. So we would see like Little Italy or, Polish Town in Chicago or Chinatown out in Seattle. These are all just examples of how people migrated and settled in neighborhoods. Often they would then live in tenements, which were very small, very challenging conditions to live in, where we would have fairly unsanitary conditions. There was a lot of disease that ran rampant. There's hundreds of people living in each building. Maybe 24 in each apartment. It's a really challenging um, way to live. And a lot of these folks that are coming in are coming home from the factory covered in, shavings of heavy metals and stuff. It's like you have to imagine that living in these houses would feel very claustrophobic and challenging. But this is what people did to try to pursue that American dream. But that did not mean that America had a wide open door, as depicted in the Emma Lazarus poem. Nativism was a very common element of um, people's experience who migrated. Nativism is this belief that people who are from the country should get better priority or better treatment than those who are coming more recently than immigrant groups. We see organizations like the Know Nothings or the Order of the Star Spangled Banner form basically to prevent Catholics and other groups from gaining political authority in this country. And the Know Nothings would go on to be a pretty significant political organization who won seats in Congress and gubernatorial elections and all that. Now, this kind of goes hand in hand with social Darwinism, this idea that only the fit are meant to survive, basically that some races are more fit than others. It's similar to Darwin, the survival of the fittest. Hey, if you're poor, well, you are unlikely fit to be wealthy or a leader in this country. And therefore, your status in society is justified. And we're going to come back to social Darwinism because it prevents people from wanting to address inequality because they see it as messing with the natural, right? This natural order. Like picture this idea of the food chain, right? With lions and sharks at the top of the food chain. And then instead apply that to Carnegie and Vanderbilt. They are the lions and the sharks. Whereas on the very bottom, we have the poor, and therefore they are in their place in nature. It's a natural thing. So that's social Darwinism, and in turn, this allows people to justify, treating migrants poorly, and this got legislated. Right, the Chinese Exclusion Act prevents the Chinese, obviously, from migrating to the United States for some time, and this is because the Americans sort of see the Chinese as unwilling to assimilate to American culture, and that they were taking jobs out in the West in particular. And so this sort of competitive thought process where it's like, we're competing with these new people for work definitely leads to discriminatory policies like the Chinese Exclusion Act. The 14th Amendment, in theory, could apply to that. But as we'll see, the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause is not quite interpreted as it was meant to by the Republican Party. We also see stuff like the alien contract labor law, which prevents migrants from getting pre-organized jobs. So, this prevents jobs from recruiting from other countries. Now, not everybody felt as though that migrants should be treated poorly. We would see the formation of groups that followed what we call the social gospel, who felt as though that workers needed to be treated, with honor and dignity, because in the Bible, it talks a lot about how, the meek shall inherit the earth, and that, the poor are just as important as anybody else. And so the social gospel is kind of like the anti social Darwinist cause. Now, what we're going to see is that in turn, people are going to try to improve the living conditions of the poor. And one example of this is through settlement houses, with people like Jane Addams opening the Hull House in Chicago, which offered classes of varying activities, trying to teach these immigrants English, how to navigate the legal process, how to become a citizen. And Jane Addams is definitely seen in history as somebody who is, really important in supporting the efforts of the poor. But that being said, some historians look at Jane Addams as being somebody who wants to Americanize these immigrants. So I'll sort of leave that to you guys to decide. But I think the settlement house folks are much nicer to immigrants than nativists. Now, I know we ended our unit in class with talking about politics, but I do feel like it's a nice continuation of our first theme, sort of focusing on the Northeast and how capitalism becomes sort of this like unfettered and incredibly powerful force. A big reason for that is because of political beliefs and the way in which the government thought they were supposed to be running themselves. So the reason that corruption was so rampant during the Gilded Age is that there's lots of wealth being concentrated in small groups, which allows for them to purchase influence. These caps on donations and the regulations around electoral campaign donations and campaign finance were not around during the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. So this would allow robber barons to buy influence. And in turn, we would see that the politicians would then take a very pro-capitalist mindset with a laissez-faire approach, basically saying, hey, business owners, do what you like. It's all about freedom. Now, when the government did take actions, often the actions that they took were tariffs, trying to eliminate competition from foreign economic pressures, land grants to the railroads, and a big one was the creation of the gold standard in the late 1880s. The gold standard made it so that basically gold would be the only thing that would be entered in for circulation. During this time period, there is sort of people advocating that silver also be being sort of included. And this basically makes it so that people with more access to gold would be able to basically benefit, whereas the working classes had better access to silver. And this because they didn't sort of utilize silver as a way in which we sort of determine the value of currency. It made it so that silver was worth less, and this hurt the middle classes and the lower classes. So this is just another example. Again, I'm not an economist, and my description here is a little bit convoluted, but at the end of the day, the gold standard makes it so that the people in the lower classes felt worse off at the end of the day. So corruption was so rampant during the Gilded Age, especially in local governments. Now we're going to see the Republican Party does get caught up in several scandals that would mar the presidencies of like Ulysses S. Grant. But the most viable and most powerful groups who were able to sort of utilize corruption to get to the top were these local political parties who form what we call political machines, which basically pump out votes. I like to refer to them more as like political mafias, with like Boss Tweed in New York City being like the don of the Casa Nostra, basically. Boss Tweed was able to basically exploit all these immigrants coming in saying, hey, vote Democrat and I'll help you get jobs in the city. He had a patronage system, which he would then, was able to share the spoils with all his political supporters. And Boss Tweed is known for being one of the most powerful politicians in the U.S. during this time. Now, how did these political machines get so powerful? Well, they're able to utilize graft. They're able to get rich by sort of messing with the books and making it so that these contracts that they form, they're going to be taking a little bit off the top, or they accept bribes. They use patronage, where they give their supporters government jobs, for which they are usually unqualified. And then finally, election fraud. They are the ones who count the votes, and therefore they are able to dominate sort of in elections. They get who they want chosen, and they get favors in return. And so during this time, there would be a political cartoonist by the name of Thomas Nast who was essential to sort of reining in the power of Boss Tweed, even leading to Boss Tweed's arrest. In Tammany Hall is sort of the organization of the Democrats in New York. And so this is one of his cartoons, The Tammany Tiger is Loose, where we see up here Boss Tweed looking down on his tiger, wreaking havoc. And what we see here is that the woman here is meant to represent the integrity of American democracy. Because Boss Tweed is able to corrupt the system, our democracy is not what it is actually meant to look like. And so Tweed becomes very criticized in the media and ultimately is arrested for this. But we are going to see corruption on the federal scale, and this is going to lead to a majorly dramatic moment in 1881 when James Garfield, the president, is shot by somebody who helped support him on the campaign trail, Charles Guiteau, who believed that he deserved the position, a very cushy job as an ambassador. And he felt because he didn't get that job, right? He didn't get the office, he took Garfield's life. This led to people saying, we need to reform the system. So we would see several attempts at government reform during the Gilded Age, though they're not all very successful yet. In our next unit, we're going to look at how politicians down the road in the early 1900s are going to build upon these different acts and make them more hardcore. The Sherman Antitrust Act sought to break up monopolistic control of industry, to make it so that not one company dominates, which is not good for an economy, and not good for workers, and not good for the people. The Interstate Commerce Act tried to regulate the price of the railroads. We're going to look at why that is the case with the Grangers in a few moments. But the biggest and most important one is the Pendleton Act. This basically creates the civil service, meaning that we have government officials who are qualified, who have degrees and experience in certain fields, which enable them to take on and do jobs that they were actually be qualified for. I know, what a crazy thought, right? Okay, now we looked at 4 different examples in class of how people believed we could go about resolving inequality, right? Because political corruption was tried to be tackled by Congress, but there's varying different views on how we could actually resolve inequality. Now, one big issue with inequality is there are some that have the mindset that we should not be changing anything in terms of inequality. And that's because of this idea of laissez-faire, right? That this pro-capitalist idea that the government should stay out of business and therefore they shouldn't be resolving inequality through socialism. But then there's also social Darwinism, which basically says that the poor are poor for a reason because they are not equipped with the right mindset or the right genes to help them. And so this would make it so that it would be challenging for the government to try and get involved. But that did not stop people to sort of try and rise up and advocate for the working classes. 2 folks that we sort of looked at in class were populists. William Jennings Bryan is the leader of the populists. He runs for president. He is able to find some success through his various speeches where he advocates for the government to step up and do something, protect the workers, end the gold standard, break up monopolies. And in particular, William Jennings Bryan would win the nomination for the Democratic Party through his speech of the Cross of Gold, where we would see him advocating that the gold standard should be eliminated and we should go back to including silver, bimetallism, in order to protect the lower classes. Mary Lease, very similarly, Mary Elizabeth Leith advocates for the working classes through a variety of measures. She wants a government for and by the people. But the wealthy did not share in this mindset. One speech in particular that we've looked at a couple times was Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, where he says, as captains of industry, we need to give our money back to help the lower classes. But he absolutely disagrees with this notion that we should be supporting the poor through government reform. He does not see that as a viable solution. We also see folks like William Graham Sumner who are going to enable robber barons to not do anything and to exploit the poor. He is a social Darwinist, one of the founders of this sort of mindset, and he's a Yale sociologist. He basically says that the rich owe the poor nothing and that the people that are poor are there because of their background, and therefore the government should not be trying to uplift people who are naturally put in that position. It would be messing with the food chain in nature. Okay, so that is sort of a general background on sort of the working classes, the politics, the rich, their battles, and why people felt it was this gap between the rich and the poor was so justified. What I want to do now to end our session is look at two other regions, the West and the South, and how they were sort of experiencing the Gilded Age in their different regions. When we looked at Unit 5, one of the core themes that we looked at was Manifest Destiny and the United States basically completing the map from sea to shining sea, right? The East Coast to the West. And through Manifest Destiny, we would see the bringing of technologies, civilization, farming, cultivating the land. We see with the light here trying to civilize it, but in turn, we're also going to see the displacement of Native Americans and the bison. I can't stress how prophetic this painting was when it was created. It really does capture what does occur, but it does not necessarily take the perspective of natives. And we're going to sort of look at what that all looks like. Another thing this doesn't account for is it looks like, we have little family farms and the people coming over. But what would come to dominate the West as it did in the Northeast was big corporations. And we're going to take a look at what that was. So in the early 1800s, we saw that Manifest Destiny allows us to justify our expansion out West. We are going to see the population is going to increase quite a bit. We're going to see that the government provides people with incentives to move out West, like the Homestead Act, which makes land incredibly cheap. We're going to see the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad through the Pacific Railway Act. And in general, we are going to see that this led to sectional divisions, right? But after the Civil War, those sectional divisions are going to die down, and the West is going to become settled. This led to Frederick Jackson Turner, who is an author, to sort of make this notion that basically that if we don't have the West anymore, it could become a problem for us, and that the West turned America into independent, rugged people that were innovative and democratic, right? Basically, the West democratized the country because anybody could go out there and try to make it, which influences the myths and the movies of the Wild West, where, everyone is a tough, badass cowboy with guns and who can go and make something of themselves. Well, in reality, people did do this, right? There were people who tried to get rich, like on the railroad, right? So people are going to go out west to San Francisco, to Colorado for Pikes Peak. And we're going to see people of various background, including Chinese migrants. But in reality, this was pretty short-lived. These boom towns where people were able to try to get rich would turn into ghost towns after all the easily accessible mineral wealth was gone. And eventually what takes over are these very wealthy and very powerful mining companies who have access to the machinery and the stuff needed to get deeper and deeper into the mines and create their own sort of companies. In addition to that, one of the big things that we see in the myth of the Wild West are cowboys. And yeah, cowboys were a big part of the meat industry where they drove cattle from Texas all the way up to places like Chicago and Kansas City for them to be processed into meat that would be consumed. And this was a real thing in the movies. One thing that's not often depicted is just how diverse the cowboys were. We would see white cowboys. There were black cowboys we call exodusters who left the South to get out of the poor conditions there and go to a more hospitable region. And then a lot of Mexican cowboys, the vaqueros, who are very well trained and adept at moving cattle because it is the Spaniards hundreds of years earlier who were bringing the cattle all the way up from Europe. Now, one of the big problems for the cowboys is they become subsumed and replaced by railroads. Railroads made shipping more efficient. Cattle were less likely to lose mass on the way over. It was more safe and less demanding. And so what we see is a shift from the wide open plains with cowboys driving cattle to then more closed off ranches where people were able to sort of own bigger swaths of land. In turn, homesteads, which again are promoted by the government, you could get 160 acres of land for $30 and begin improving it. This is a really good deal, but it was not easy living. In the bottom right corner, I have a picture here of a homesteader. I see people on TikTok doing like homesteading, right? Oh, I'm raising my children on our farm. And it looks very glamorous, but I promise you, it is not as easy as they make it look on TikTok. Now, in general, people going out west, this is promoted by the government. The government saw this as a good thing, but in reality, most homesteaders are going to go bust. And that's because out west, family farms are going to become replaced and dominated by bonanza farms, or these much larger, more industrial or corporate farms with machinery like the steel plow and the mechanical reaper, who utilize wage labor and grand economies of scale, which are going to sort of drive crop prices down, making it harder for family farms to make a living. We're going to see corn and wheat prices go way low during this time because it's easier to make with all this machinery. And in addition to that, the railroads made it so that family farms struggled because they would raise rates extremely high for small farmers and made it less expensive for the very, very wealthy big corporations. These corporations often collaborated with one another to dominate industries. And Jay Gould is depicted as a literal monster here on the right side for sort of the hold that he had over the courthouses. And if you would look here, this is his Western Union Telegraph and Railway, which is his business that dominates the West. Now, in turn, because of the poor conditions for farmers that emerged during the Gilded Age, we are going to see the emergence of the Granger movement, which I like to think of basically the labor movement for the West, where farmers came together to form cooperatives to try to make it so that way the rates of the rails would be cheaper. Grain elevator companies would not be so expensive to use, so that farmers weren't being as exploited and the prices that they paid weren't unfairly high. The Grangers actually were successful at getting laws passed in places like I think it was Minnesota and Wisconsin were some of the most successful. And we would see that this pushed back against unfair railway practices and reined in the power of agribusiness. And this political cartoon, I think, is great because we see the Grange here waking up the farmers before the train runs them over. Now, that being said, as the West is being settled in, one of the key elements that we are going to see is that Native Americans are going to be displaced. And we're going to see a tactical shift from the American government in trying to sort of further encroach on Native American land. One tactic that they're going to utilize is the killing of the buffalo. The other is going to be assimilation through schools like the Carlisle Indian School. So remember that in the 1830s, Andrew Jackson becomes president. And this is when the Trail of Tears is going to take place, where the Cherokee and other groups from the Southeast are moved out to the West, to places like Oklahoma, which were deemed Indian territory, and the land is divided up for different tribes. Now, one of the things that we're going to see is that as these tribal groups are settled in, the settlers out west want that land because land is becoming more and more scarce as more and more people move out to the West. So a way to try to limit Native Americans in the West was to try to force them onto reservations by killing their food supply. We would see the buffalo are destroyed in turn. But then in general, as homesteaders, prospectors, and ranchers encroached on native land, the U.S. Army was brought in, and we would see wars take place out west with Buffalo Soldiers, as they were called, following the Civil War going out west. They would force Native Americans to sign new treaties, and then they would be broken, and then they would sign new treaties. And this would force natives into a position where they had to foster resistance movements. This is exemplified by what we saw at Little Bighorn. This was a battle between the sort of the Lakota Sioux and the Dakotas, who were fighting back against the U.S. military from cracking down. And it is going to be successful. The Sioux launched a successful offensive against the U.S. military. And as the settlers are coming in to try to get the gold in the in the Dakotas, we are going to see that the Sioux are able to defeat the military, which is going to hold off for a brief moment, the further encroachment of native lands. However, the U.S. military is going to continue their crackdown on these native groups, and this is when we start to see the ghost dance, which begins to sort of sweep through the Dakotas. Now, the ghost dance was basically a movement where tribal groups would do this particular dance in sort of a circular motion to try to invoke their spirits, like the buffalo, to ward off these invaders. They would call upon their ancestors for protection, and they felt as though that this could work as like a last ditch effort. Now, the police are going to, or should I say, the lawmakers are going to make ghost dance illegal, and so the police begin cracking down on these movements. And one of the big resistance leaders of sort of the Native Americans, this man who is very famous in both Native American and white circles, Sitting Bull, is put under arrest by the authorities and is actually killed in the process. And in turn, we are going to see that various protests emerge, and we're going to see a big coalescing at a place called Wounded Knee, where the army comes in and lays waste, and we're going to see many Native Americans are killed in the process. And this kind of marks the end of the Native American Wars in 1890. Now, as this is happening, Native American land is being sort of more and more infringed upon through policies like the Dawes Allotment Act, which allows for the president to confiscate and redistribute tribal lands. So white folks are moving into formerly Native American reserved territory. 90 million acres are lost in the process. And in turn, we're going to see a lot more interaction between whites and natives. And so the policy is going to be a shift from violence and war toward assimilation, where one general puts it, all there is in the Indian race should die. Basically, if you kill the Native American culture, you can save the Native Americans, is this mindset. It really is kind of a disgusting sort of mindset, but this is the reality of people out west. And so we're going to see a period of assimilation, which I would describe as like a cultural genocide, trying to eliminate all elements of Native American culture in order to force them to become Americanized, learn English, take on, European cultures and customs, and losing parts of their own culture. One of the ways they did this was by taking young children to schools like Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, where in the modern day we have seen some cover-ups took place back in the day under federal care, where some Native American children passed away. Almost 1,000 corpses have been found. It's not good stuff. And this serves as an example of what it was like to be a Native in the waning days of sort of the Wild West and the closing of the frontier. Now, to shift gears to the South, this idea of the South is important that we evaluate, because remember, the South is there is an unclear picture of where the South is headed after the Civil War. After the Civil War, one man named Henry Grady says it's time for the South to change. And he writes this essay saying that the new South is going to be one that industrializes and shifts away from a cash crop economy. So what we're going to see is the implementation of rail networks brought down to the South. We're also going to see that some industries are able to sort of coalesce around, the former cash crop economy. So like tobacco and cotton would lead to the rise of a textile industry in the Piedmont region of North Carolina, or, the tobacco industry, went from being just, growing the crop to then, manufacturing, cigarettes and cigars and stuff. Now, the problem with this idea of the New South becoming industrialized is the South refuses to change other elements of its culture. And really what I'm referring to here is the inability or unwillingness to hire Black workers to work in these industries. There is a huge Black populace that is newly minted as citizens in the South. And these folks, in theory, could be workers in these, industrial settings, but they refused to hire Black workers. 94% of Southern industrial workers were white. The North has control over investment capital. The South is not really putting an emphasis on public education. Therefore, like, manufacturing is going to be tougher if you don't have the engineers and people who understand how these systems work, or business leaders who are going to be able to sort of organize the supply chain. And then in general, working wages were very, very cheap. So there's not a willingness to shift from this agrarian economy we saw to then an industrial one. And in addition to that, we're going to see that a continuity from the old South to the new one is that Black Americans' rights and freedoms are going to be suppressed. And this is going to be backed up by Supreme Court rulings, which make it harder for Black Americans to sort of achieve basic civil rights. A big example of this is the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, in which we would see that a Black man, technically, right? I mean, in the modern day, if you saw this guy, he would appear, maybe mixed race, but largely white. He's 1/8 Black. But under Louisiana law, that made him a Black man. That sort of goes off this idea of the one drop rule, which was a policy in which one drop of Black blood would determine you as African American. And so he is choosing to challenge these various laws, which are going to make it harder for him to get equality in the South. Now, he sits in the black or the white only section of a rail car, and he is going to refuse to get up. And his goal is to stop segregation by challenging it in the courts. He does this as an activist, right? Now, when this happens, the Supreme Court interprets the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause to say that it is okay to have segregation as long as the separate facilities are equal, then it is okay. So separate but equal is sort of the tagline we associate with Plessy versus Ferguson. And this opens the door wide open to Jim Crow and this idea of segregation. Jim Crow laws were laws passed to prevent Black people from integrating and being on equal footing with whites in the South. It is indicative of the South's sort of mindset in the post-Reconstruction world, where having gone through this Civil War, we're kind of going back in time and taking steps backwards towards equality in the South. Now, with the 14th Amendment being interpreted as such, we are going to see that other amendments like the 15th Amendment are going to be violated. With the 15th Amendment, which gave Black folks the right to vote if you're a man, we're going to see loopholes like the literacy tests and grandfather clauses and poll taxes. All are sort of ways in which they would limit Black voting, right? And this is despicable stuff. And you could also even argue the 13th Amendment, which bans slavery, has its own loophole, which is created through sharecropping. So all that is to say, the South, while it claims to be headed in a new direction, largely goes back in time. And so we are going to see that there are people around the country disgusted by the conditions of Jim Crow and who are going to start to begin to fight back against this. What we could say is the early days of the formation of a civil rights movement. And there are two men that historians point to as sort of being instrumental in leading the charge, one of which is Booker T. Washington. The other is W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Booker T. Washington was born into slavery in Alabama, I believe. And he was somebody that felt we needed to work within segregation, that radical change would only bring danger for Black Americans. W.E.B. Du Bois was born in Massachusetts. He's a graduate of Harvard with a PhD. So his lived experience is very different, and he articulates a very different argument. While Booker T. Washington says, let's work within segregation and create a separate, self-sufficient Black society, W.E.B. Du Bois criticizes Booker T. Washington. He says that you can't accommodate these Southern whites and go along with their wishes. We need to challenge them. And he says that we need a class of intellectual leaders, the top 10% of all sort of Black academics and public speakers, and bring them in to sort of create a movement with momentum to push back against Jim Crow. And so while Booker T. Washington is advocating to stay within segregation, Du Bois is doing the complete opposite. He is looking to challenge that notion and fight back against it. And so you can give consideration to which you find more successful or which would be a better move during this time. I mean, for me, I look at Booker T. Washington. Sure, he's easy to criticize, but he was also born into slavery. Think about what having a separate, self-sufficient Black society that, elevated and educated Black folks. I think that that's a noble cause. I understand where Du Bois is coming from. As somebody from Massachusetts, though, does he know the true realities of Jim Crow? Obviously, right? Massachusetts looks very different from Alabama or Mississippi. And while no, of course, he doesn't have true equality in the Northeast. Again, look at the opportunities Du Bois had. He was able to go to Harvard. He's an incredibly exceptional academic. So I think we have to give both of these guys their considerations. And I do think that while Booker T. Washington in history is not looked at in the same regard, I think, as W.E.B. Du Bois, I think Washington is certainly an innovator for the time period in which he lives. But this is a generational split, right? Booker T. Washington is like from an era that looks very different from when Du Bois comes into adulthood. And so these guys have very different views on how we achieve equality. We'll see the same trends pop up during the civil rights movement. Do we go more radical or do we go slow but sure? And these are sort of the debates that are going to play out as we look at the civil rights movement all the way into the 1950s, 60s, and beyond. Folks, I hope that you find this video helpful. Best of luck on your tests. Rooting for you guys to do great. Thank you for your time and have a wonderful long weekend. Thanks, everybody.